We talked to a bunch of Ohio State football players today at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, 20 in total, and we're trying to get an indication of what that first week was like for them. It's the first chance we've had to talk to most of these guys since the Michigan loss started a week, and then a week later, 8 days later, finding out that they are going to the playoff because Utah beat USC. And it was a tumultuous week, as Ryan Day has already told us. But, Stephen, obviously losing that game to Michigan, it was a year buildup to try to win that game. And the first thing that they had to deal with that week was processing a loss. I talked to Luke Whippler, and I was like, what was your attitude? What was kind of how did you feel that day? And Luke's a pretty verbose guy most of the time, but he struggled to come up with a word. He finally just said defeated, and it doesn't really go away. And you could tell that was something that motivated these guys now, regardless of what game they're playing next. It's been something that, like, somebody called it like a splash of cold water in the face.
Yeah, I think the more people we talk about this, I think the best way I could sum it up is shocked but hadn't lost hope. And CJ kind of alluded, Stroud kind of alluded at that, is that's the main difference between this year and last year. Last year, you lost to Michigan. It's your second loss. You know you're not going to the playoff. The season's over with. So it is gloomy with no light at the end of the tunnel there. This was, Julian Fleming alluded to this. They had been talking about how we're going to get Georgia, we're going to get Georgia, we're going to get Georgia, we're going to get Georgia. That's the mindset that they were putting in their heads as they're trying to go through two practices where they don't know what they're practicing for. They could be practicing for a trip to the Orange Bowl or a trip to the playoff. They don't know yet. But they had that in the back of their heads. So it did provide a little bit of hope that when it happened, there was a sigh of relief, but it also didn't completely catch them off guard because they were able to stay positive this year in a way that they weren't the year before, which, I mean, and now they're still out here in the background of us still working on stuff like that. Is that happening a year ago when you know you're headed to the Rose Bowl and you're not competing for a championship?
So we've always talked about this time of year, bowl season, being a time when guys make a transition sometimes from being role players, and especially if you're not going to the playoff, guys leave, and now it's your chance to step up and take on a bigger role, or you just assert yourself during bowl practices. And it can happen from a leadership standpoint too. And JT Tuimoloau is a guy that is happening for kind of as this is going on, because he talked about there was a time earlier this year going to the Indiana week where he felt like he was given an opportunity to step up and talk to the team, and he backed off and said no, like, let one of the older guys do that, like that's, I'm not ready for that yet. And it had been like bugging him. It was eating at him that he had let that moment get away. And when he sensed coming out of that Michigan loss that this team was down and this team was there were some guys feeling a little bit hopeless, or that the season was over, he felt it was his time to step up. And we heard it from Tanner McAllister, we heard it from other guys today, that when he stepped up and spoke up and got kind of loud with them and shook them up a little bit, and it helped set a tone for that week and got them thinking that they shouldn't waste those days, even if they didn't know who they were going to play or when they were going to play or what they were playing for, that they should find value in those practices. And as it turned out, that kind of helped get them started for what is now a great opportunity to go still potentially play for a national championship. So that kind of got them thinking the right way, but they still needed help, which was an uncomfortable position for these guys, waiting around to see if somebody else was going to win and let them into the playoff. And Doug, that led to some interesting, some funny stories about watching that Utah USC game that night, where guys are like rooting for Bryson Shaw and also hoping he loses.
Yeah, so everybody on that Friday night, they were all watching USC Utah, and there were multiple stories of they were more invested watching a game than they had been in years, because these are guys that play games. So, Steele Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg live together. They live with Cade Stover. Steele was talking about he and Tommy were sitting there like yelling at the TV, screaming at Bryson Shaw, because Bryson Shaw, the former Buckeye who was a safety here last year, transferred to USC as a starting safety for them, was making plays for USC, and they were like, "What are you doing? You're keeping us out of the playoff, but like, good job, old teammate, but stop it." He said they were yelling at Bryson Shaw, and they were going crazy. Zach Harrison said he was like, I was living my life, but I was watching on TV. I was watching on my phone. DeJuan Jones was at a high school football game, and people were coming up and giving him updates, and USC was off to an early lead, and he's like, it's over. And then it was a close game at halftime. Then he felt great. And so, like, these guys they were like you. They were totally invested in a football game. I asked Zach Harrison if he was yelling at the TV. He was like, why would I yell at the TV? They can't hear me. And I'm like, you are a very different person than Steele Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg. So, but they were that invested in it. But the sense that I think they were practicing that week, and when JT gave the speech, they were practicing that week for Georgia. They weren't practicing because, oh, well, we're going to play a game no matter what. They started practicing for Georgia, and then they needed something to happen. So they had built up to this, well, now we're ready, and now we need the help. And then they got the help. And so that emotional swing, I mean, that you think about that 6-day swing from the end of Saturday you lose to Michigan to that Friday night, you're watching USC give you life. I mean, it's I think they all express that. It is an incredible emotional swing, but I think what you guys talked about, I think there's a sense among them that they gained a couple days of prep in there because they didn't waste it. And that's what they were saying JT's speech was, right? Don't waste these days. And so they started preparing for a specific thing that they didn't know if it would happen or not. And then when it did, they were like ahead of the game. And I think there's some momentum to that. And they're talking about chippiness at practice, but I do think there's an attitude of these guys that the idea that you start preparing for something before you know it, I think has turned into something that they're hanging on to.
And one of the guys I talked to today, and it's escaping me now because there were 20 of them, but he said, we haven't watched a lot of film, or we haven't done a lot of game prep. It might have been Tanner McAllister. We haven't done a lot of game prep yet in practice, but we're watching a lot of film of Georgia, and we know what's coming. We know what we're up against. So I think you're right. It started even early that week because they just played Michigan, and they knew that the chances of them playing Michigan in the first round were a little remote, but if they did, they had just played them. They'd done a lot of prep for that. So what's the next most likely outcome, or even the most likely outcome, was to play Georgia, and it was smart to get that started that week. A lot more coming on this on Buckeye Talk. Get that wherever you can find podcasts, and get the texts, 614-350-3315, $3.99 after a 2-week free trial. Sign up for that now, and it takes you pretty much through the rest of this playoff run for Ohio State from cleveland.com and Buckeye Talk.